Welcome, everybody, to this Google Hangout in the series run under the auspices of the Network for Jobs and Development as part of the World Bank and Development Policy Research Unit project. And for our purposes today, we are going to initiate what we hope will be a really interesting discussion on the role that minimum wages and enforcement plays in understanding both employment and economic outcomes in the developing world. And what I'd like to do before proceeding to the formalities of the questions that will guide our discussion is to ask each of our presenters to quickly and very briefly introduce themselves. If I could start with Uma Rani first.
Thanks a lot, Harun, for inviting me to the Google Hangout on Labor Regulations and Development. I'm Uma Rani, the Senior Economist at the Research Department at the ILO. I work on issues related to minimum wages, poverty, inequality, among others. Thank you.
And if Tim could introduce himself.
Hello, I'm Tim Gindling. I'm a professor of economics at UMBC, University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And I also obviously work on issues of minimum wages and enforcement in particular, and primarily in Latin America.
And thank you, Tim. And Lucas?
Hello, I'm Lucas Ronconi. I'm the Director of Research at Centro de Investigación y Acción Social and CONICET in Buenos Aires. I work on labor and social issues.
Thank you, Lucas. And finally, Piotr.
Hello, everyone. I'm Piotr Lewandowski from Institute for Structural Research, IBS, Warsaw, Poland. And like everybody in this meeting, in this debate, I'm working on labor economics, in particular temporary contracts, minimum wages, and broader regulation of issues.
Great. Thank you very much to all of you, and thank you for giving us your valuable time to join us for this Google Hangout. I think the background and the backdrop to this discussion is really important in the sense that we've to some extent moved away from what I like to call the Stigler view of the world around minimum wages, which is that everywhere and always minimum wages will lead to a loss in employment. As the audience out there knows very well, primarily through the seminal work of David Card and Alan Kruger, that piece of work on minimum wages in the fast food world in the US ushered in a new minimum wage literature that began to question whether minimum wages necessarily had the economic outcomes that we expected a priori from first principles. But what I think one could almost call the third wave of minimum wage literature has been this mushrooming of evidence in the developing world and in the emerging market world. And I think that's particularly exciting in and of itself, simply because firstly because we have new evidence for a new set of countries around employment impacts, wages, poverty, inequality, and so on from the developing world. But actually, secondly, because it's introduced, and this is really the topic of today's discussion, it's introduced a new, if you like, variable into the minimum wage economic outcome interaction, namely the role of enforcement, or if one likes to think of it, the role of violation of minimum wages in our understanding of the impact of minimum wages. Principally, the developed country evidence shows the spike in the normal distribution of wages where the minimum wage is set, and the spike represents, if you like, in many ways, perfect enforcement or zero violation or close to zero violation of the law in developed countries. In the developing countries, we don't see that spike as visible or as obvious, and I think that's the entry point for thinking about violation of the law. So if I could just open it up with Uma in particular. Uma, what are some of the key trends and results emerging from the global developing country work that you've been involved at the ILO with both in terms of the level and the extent of violation. So what are the kinds of trends that you're seeing based on the cross-country work that you've done?
Thanks, Arun, for that question. Now, before I enter into giving you some numbers with regard to the trends, I think I'd like to just highlight at this point of time that there's not one measure of measuring what we call in this literature the non-compliance, but there are different approaches of measuring that. One is what we use in the statistical terms, the earnings data, and try to actually estimate a proportion of workers who earn less than the minimum wages in different jobs and sectors. That's the most widely used as far as the empirical literature is concerned. But there are two other measures that are there which one needs to mention, though they are not often used. One is that of looking into the violation of minimum wage laws as such, which is detected during workplace inspection. Now, this is only partial information. As a result, many of the studies don't take this into consideration. The other one is with regard to the number of complaints which are made by the workers in enforcement before enforcement bodies or courts or whatsoever. Again, this means that one needs to rely on administrative data, which is not very easy to get. So as a result, not many studies actually utilize it. Now, using the first measure, which is using the earnings data and trying to actually estimate the proportion of workers who actually receive minimum wages or not, we have tried to do the study across a whole range of developing countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And we find that the proportion of workers receiving less than minimum wages varies around less than 10% in countries like Vietnam and Mexico to about 50% in countries like Indonesia and Turkey. Now, we also observed that, you could have a similar level of minimum wages as it's the case in Brazil, India, or South Africa, but the level of compliance can be quite varied, where it is very high in the former, that is Brazil, than in South Africa and India. Similarly, we find that you could have similar levels of compliances, like in the case of Peru and Costa Rica, but the minimum wage is higher in Costa Rica than in Peru. Now, this raises a fundamental or a very important issue, saying that while minimum wages could be biting with relatively high compliance, which indicates that you could have non-compliance associated with the level at which the minimum wage is set, but what actually matters is also the institution factors which come into play. Now, within countries, we find that there's huge variation also among different population groups. You have high levels of compliance in urban areas and in rural areas, in formal sectors than informal sectors. Then the level of compliance is much lower for women and among certain socially disadvantaged ethnic or caste groups. Like in the case of India, you have the scheduled castes or scheduled tribes, or the Africans or blacks in South Africa. So overall, we find when we get into the whole question of what is the extent of or the level of violation, we find that it is about 1/3 of the workers among these developing countries do not get minimum wages. Now, coming to the extent of violation, which is again computed as a gap between the average subminimum wage earnings and the minimum wage, we find that in these developing countries, the extent of violation is averaged around 30 to 40%. And it is, well, there are certain externalities, like in Turkey, it is about 21% less, or in Mali it is 69% less. So you have these wide variations that exist, but in general it's about 30 to 40%. On average, we find that it is about 33%. In these countries, when workers do not receive minimum wages, it is on average about 33% less. So again, similar to that of compliance, we find that the extent of violation is much higher among females, informal sector, and some of the disadvantaged groups. So this is what we sort of get when we look at the overall picture for a whole set of developing countries that we have done analysis for.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Uma. I mean, I think it's a wonderful entry point for Lucas to provide us with some of the experience in Latin America. I mean, to some extent, Lucas, do you think that based on the work that you've done for Latin America, some of the right-hand side variables, some of these determinants that Uma is talking about, such as number of inspectors and so on, explain in your view the level of violation? And then also, do you see the same distribution of, or the incidence of violation across the covariates that Uma has raised? Lucas?
Well, thanks, Harun. Thanks, guys. Well, first, let me say that Latin America, as we all know, is the most unequal region in the world. So, based on that structural problem, we can think that the minimum wage has an important role to play. However, policymakers in Latin America tend to see the minimum wage in an aspirational way. They set the minimum wage, but they do not expect that every worker will earn the minimum wage. And I think that the research that has been done showing that rates of compliance are quite high, at least in some Latin American countries, not in all, of course, is pointing out to the issue that it's not enough to simply pass a law saying that the minimum wage should be at a certain level, that we should do something else. And of course, one of the main instruments that the government has is enforcement, and among the different enforcement tools, one is labor inspection. Now, policymakers sometimes have a fear that enforcing the minimum wage will produce job destruction. However, and of course that is a very hard empirical question to answer, but the evidence that we tend to have shows that enforcing the minimum wage, unless it's extremely high minimum wage relative to the median wage in the economy, that at least in the short run it does not produce job destruction. So I think that we are starting to see that to have an effective minimum wage policy, we should go beyond the letter of the law and try to, at the same time, increase enforcement. Now, there is still a dilemma in Latin America, because in the mind of policymakers, the minimum wage is usually set thinking about labor conditions in large firms, and we know that labor conditions in small firms, which are usually less productive, is different from labor conditions in large firms. So that is a little bit of a challenge, and that is a challenge in particularly because due to our non-democratic past, we now, the actual democratic governments want to have the same minimum wage for every single worker, which is a reasonable objective. Now, when you have differences in productivity across regions within countries or across firms within countries, is that objective of having the same single minimum wage as in Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and so on, and at the same time have enforcement, that is a little bit, it's a hard, those two objectives are a little bit hard to reconcile. So the point I want to make here is that in Latin America, so far, policymakers have been thinking about the minimum wage in an aspirational way. We are now realizing that simply writing a high minimum wage in the letter of the law is not enough, that low-skilled workers end up simply being below the minimum wage. There is large shares of non-compliance, so something else should be done. some evidence is showing that enforcement helps ensuring compliance. Now there is still this debate about taking into account differences in productivity, but at the same time having this more sort of democratic rule where we treat every single worker the same way and where we set the same minimum wage across regions and firms.
Great, thanks for that, Lucas. I mean, leading on to you, Piotr. I mean, do you think that you know, based on what Lucas has said, there's certain drivers, like for example, how high one sets the minimum wage relative to the mean or the median wage, the so-called sort of kites ratio. Do you think, based on that kind of evidence and other sort of factors impacting on violation, that there's a particular split between, say, emerging market settings and the violation of the law, or is it randomly distributed across the developing country sample in terms of levels of violation? And in particular, if you could draw on your evidence for Poland, for example.
So in the experience of the Central and Eastern European countries, which are basically a group of countries that were under the communism until the end of 1980s and then transferred to the market economy, the experience of these countries shows that the extent of violation of the minimum wage can vary largely between countries, and you can't really explain that extent of violation by the different choices in terms of how high the minimum wage is. However, you can see that the countries which have been more aspirational, using the term coined by Lucas in this discussion, so the countries that were more aspirational in how they increase the minimum wages, they actually saw increasing violation. So in that set of countries that all have nationwide minimum wage, which is basically binding for all dependent workers, so it's not really differentiated between sectors or occupations, so it should be quite easy to enforce. There is a huge difference. For example, Czech Republic or Bulgaria have average extent of violation very low, about 1 or 2% between the middle 2000s and middle 2010s, whereas Lithuania, Latvia, Hungary, Poland had around 5, 6, 7% extent of violation. So there is a huge difference, and the difference is not really driven by how high the minimum wage is in particular countries. So there has to be something going on the ground in terms of how it is enforced, or maybe actually what are the practices in particular countries. What I find interesting is that all of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, they set up minimum wages in monthly terms. Sometimes, in particular countries, there is an hourly minimum wage, but it's basically, let's say, to make calculations of wages easier. In principle, they are set on minimum wage on monthly basis. And what we find is that in many countries, there is a noticeable violation by hours. So the companies try to set up a contract, for example, for full-time 40 hours per week, but workers are actually working 45. So there are numerous ways of how we can play around the rules, or we can set up, write a contract for 30 hours per week, and actually make a worker work 40 hours per week. And this extent of violation, I think it's very hard to, this type of violation is very hard to track, because I think it's quite unlikely for a worker to report that is working unpaid extra hours, whereas on the contract, when on the contract he has a minimum wage, because it's very hard to prove actually that this is happening systematically, that he's not being paid, let's say, next month more money or whatever. So I think the flow in how the minimum wages have been set up across the region is that often when the change is being implemented in terms of more ambitious levels or more complex solutions, there is not enough reflection, not enough thought given into what are these details that potential violators can use to actually violate the rules. But I hope we can return to these details later in the discussion.
Great, thanks, Piotr. I think that does give us sort of a nice entry point into Tim. Tim, if you could partly reflect on Piotr's assertion that, based on your research for China, if I recall the literature and the work you've done, which shows commitment to the minimum wage, but actually violation of overtime pay and things like that. So methods, creative methods that that employers may use to violate the law but still pay the minimum wage, and the Chinese evidence may be instructive. But if you could overlay that, Tim, with a reflection of some of the more creative and innovative methods used by Latin American authorities to enforce the law, or at least publicize the fact that a law has been set and so on. So rather sort of a two-part answer. The second part really about enforcement mechanisms. Tim?
Okay, thank you, Harun. Yes, and the work that I've done with Li Shi and Lin Jiangye in China, we did indeed find that there was widespread compliance with minimum wage laws, but that employers were able to adjust to changes in minimum wages and adjust to binding minimum wages by using another component of employment policy, and that was by forcing employees to work overtime. And because the overtime laws were not enforced nearly as well, or not complied with nearly as well as the minimum wage laws, employees often worked overtime without any additional pay beyond the minimum wage. And so in terms of an hourly minimum wage, many employees were earning less than the minimum wage, even though they were earning the same as a monthly minimum wage. And I think that actually leads to, before we move on to policies of compliance, that leads to another issue that we found in a number of countries that we've looked at, in a number of developing countries, and I think mostly throughout Latin America. Wages tend to be thought of in monthly terms. Wages, and for that reason, minimum wages tend to be set for as monthly minimum wages or daily minimum wages for full-time workers. And one thing this does is it makes it very difficult for part-time workers to be paid minimum wages, or to impose compliance on employers for part-time workers or overtime work. Effectively, in these countries, there are often no minimum wages for part-time workers because the employers aren't going to pay part-time workers the minimum wage for full-time workers, and yet there's no way to really calculate. There's nothing in the law that specifically looks at part-time workers. The second part of your question is related to, or you had asked me to talk about a program to increase compliance, a government program to increase compliance in Costa Rica that we looked at. And this program was interesting and somewhat innovative. There were largely three components. The first was an increase in inspections. The second was to incorporate, to a degree, employees into the compliance process themselves by setting up a call center where employees could call in and I think denounce might be too strong of a word, but argue, present that their employers were not paying the minimum wage or violating some other labor regulation, and it could be done anonymously. And every complaint made to the call center was followed up by an inspection of the firm that was complained about. And the third component was a publicity campaign designed to change the social norm. Newspaper ads, posters on bus stops. The President talked about minimum wages in her speeches. The Minister of Labor had a press conference at least every month talking about compliance with minimum wages and progress in compliance with minimum wages. All of those components together reduced non-compliance with minimum wages. We did a very rigorous analysis, evaluation of the program, found that it did indeed reduce non-compliance. It did increase wages, and I think most importantly, and this goes along with a comment that Lucas made, it did not lead to, as far as we could tell, any sort of negative employment effects. In terms of raising minimum wages and the work that we've done in Costa Rica, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, we've consistently found that raising minimum wages tends to shift employment into the informal sector, tends to reduce formal sector employment, create more informalization of the labor force. Contrary to that, what we found with this increased compliance was an increase in formalization of the labor force. No reduction in formal employment, but increase in formalization, and an increase in formalization in a range of indicators related to formalization. Not only did the program lead to increased compliance with minimum wages, it also led to increased compliance with payroll taxes, with health insurance, with paid vacations, etc. And so that's something that I think it would be worth talking about. I believe that Lucas came up with very similar results for increased compliance in Argentina. I think that, if I recall correctly, Rita Almeida and others in Brazil came up with similar results, that improved compliance, rather than having an informalization effect, tends to have a formalization effect. Okay, and I'll hold off and have some more questions later.
Great. Thanks, Tim. I mean, there's sort of a couple of issues bubbling around. One is the relative value of the minimum wage and whether that seems to increase violation levels. Piotr's evidence suggests perhaps not. There's the notion that employers violate, if you like, regulatory components of the minimum wage orbit. So we comply with the minimum wage, but we actually violate other aspects of the labor regulatory architecture to reduce labor costs. But Lucas made an interesting point, which I think he wants to come back to. But let me first hand over to Uma in relation to Lucas's point about minimum wages and productivity. So Uma, if you want to sort of come in on that.
Yes, thanks, Haroon. I just thought it's important to get back to this point that Lucas talked on productivity, actually. Based on our work, what we found it very interesting was countries which had single minimum wage or countries that did not have very complicated systems were the ones where we had very high compliance rates. And most of Latin America actually fall under that hold, though there are countries like Costa Rica and Peru where you have kind of hybrid systems, but there again the compliance was much higher than the rest of the developing countries in Asia and Africa. But you do have, I think his point on productivity is well taken, and you do have countries which do have sectoral and occupational level minimum wages. Like, to take an example, one extreme example can be that of India, where you have 1,689 minimum wages. Now, when you have such a high number of minimum wages, which takes into consideration productivity at the occupational and the sectoral level, that's very good to say that fine, you know, that is the minimum wage set for that sector. But the question that arises from it is how many people are actually aware of it? And there was a study that was actually undertaken by the government of India on the construction industry, if I remember, and that too within that segment, where they found that only 8% of the workers were actually aware about the minimum wage for that particular activity, and about 18% of the employers were aware of it. So this raises a very fundamental question, saying that, you know, you could have these varying levels of minimum wages, taking into consideration productivity, sector, occupation, and all of that. To what extent is it effective? And it very clearly shows from our own data as India is one of the countries which has a very huge non-compliance. And it's much recently that the compliance has come down, and that has to do with the national minimum wage, awareness campaign that was raised for the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. That's the one that actually led to higher minimum wages, because there was a lot of awareness campaign, information sharing, and a whole lot of things. So I think one needs to be very careful about the number of minimum wages that we need to set. And I like the point that actually Tim actually led us to, saying that we need to do something about the entire institutional mechanisms, the inspectionate, and be innovative in how we want to deal with it. And I think I'd like to also come back on that later. But as of now, on this point, that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Uma. I mean, Lucas, before I hand over to you for a response, could you think of, I mean, to some extent, Uma is saying greater simplicity improves enforcement, or if you like, reduces violation, simply because there's a single minimum wage or there are fewer schedules. That's a compelling argument. If you could reflect a little bit on that. And then secondly, appended to that, it's just an idea that's bobbing around a little bit in my head, is that, you know, we always look at these elasticities for developing countries, the minimum wage employment elasticities, and we come up with sort of fairly benign effects, right? And I wonder to what extent that's a function of, and if you compare it to high-income countries, the elasticities are higher. And to what extent is that a function of higher levels of violation? So in other words, can we do, if one can think of a distribution of violation levels across the elasticities, do you find that if you had higher levels of that if you had better enforcement, that we're likely to see higher minimum wage employment elasticities? That's just, we don't have evidence yet, but just something to reflect on. Lucas?
Yeah, let me take on your first question, Harun, and the comment by Uma. I think here about the single minimum wage. I think that we face a trade-off. And that trade-off is, there is no way to avoid it. And I totally agree about the benefits of having a single minimum wage, not only in terms of simplicity, it's also sort of nice from a social perspective to live in a society where it tells, well, you know, every single worker, regardless of the size of the firm where he works, and most importantly, regardless of the place in the country where he lives, should earn at least this level, and that level is the same all around the country. Having said that, let me tell you that in some, particularly in some large developing countries such as Brazil, and let me take the example of Argentina because it's an extreme example, there are huge differences in the level of productivity across regions. If you're a worker in the in the province of Buenos Aires, which is a very productive from natural resources place, the minimum wage should be similar to a southern European country. Now, if you live in the northern part of Argentina, in the border to Paraguay and Bolivia, the level of productivity, the level of GDP per capita in those provinces is about 20% of the level of GDP per capita in the province of Buenos Aires. So nowadays Argentina has the same minimum wage all around the country. What happens? That minimum wage, which is about $500 per month, it is really low for a worker in Buenos Aires, but it's extremely high for a worker in the northern provinces. So nowadays you have every single worker in the province of Buenos Aires earning above the minimum wage, so the minimum wage is basically non-binding in the province of Buenos Aires, And now you have about 60–70% of private sector employees in the northern provinces earning below the minimum wage. Now you go to, and so I think that having a single minimum wage in a large federal country with so high levels of differences in productivity across regions is not the most appropriate policy. Of course, again, let me go back to what Uma was saying. It is clear that there is a trade-off here between simplicity and trying to adjust to the realities of your own economy. For smaller countries, having a single minimum wage, I will tend to go for that. But for larger federal countries, to have an effective minimum wage, we might want to consider variation. At least, for example, have a single real minimum wage. We are always talking about the nominal minimum wage, but really we are concerned about how many goods and services workers can buy. So what we have in mind is a real minimum wage. So perhaps we should move to a real minimum wage. Now that will be a little bit tougher because you have to take into account differences in the level of price levels and so on. So that's basically the point I want to make here. There is a trade-off, and sometimes it is unavoidable.
Thank you, Lucas. Tim, do you agree? Do you agree that a single minimum wage in an environment of heterogeneity across states or within a country, very large sort of heterogeneity in productivity levels means that a single minimum wage may not be the route to go? Tim?
Yes, I think I agree with both Uma and Lucas that a single minimum wage is easier to enforce. However, I think there is a distinction between multiple minimum wages that are set by region and multiple minimum wages that are set by occupation or skill level or industry. It makes perfect sense to have different minimum wages set by region because cost of living differences are going to be different across regions. And as Lucas said, setting a real minimum wage in a sense is setting the same minimum wage for all workers across the country. Whereas if you have the same nominal minimum wage in Buenos Aires and in other parts of the country, then that minimum wage is effectively higher in real terms, in purchasing power terms, in outside of Buenos Aires. So the single minimum wage for different regions, to me, makes considerable sense. It's also, I think, relatively easy to enforce because everyone within a region will know what that single minimum wage is. On the other hand, minimum wages that are set by industry or by occupation related to the productivity of workers in that industry and occupation, I think are much more difficult to enforce because that's when it becomes difficult for employees and employers to know what the minimum wage is for a specific worker. One of the issues that the call center in Costa Rica needed to address was that, as Uma mentioned, so many workers did not know what their minimum wage was supposed to be. And so one of the things that the call center did was, and one of the large number of calls that they received was from workers asking what the minimum wage should be, what their employer should be paying. I also want to make an additional point related to the multiple minimum wage discussion, and also related to Lucas's point about minimum wages sometimes being aspirational. And that is that in the countries where we have spent the most time, and that's the Central American countries, there are multiple minimum wages by industry or by occupation, and there's also a good deal of non-compliance. And it's also expected. In the discussions we've had with minimum wage councils and inspectors, it's expected that there will be a large degree of non-compliance, that the minimum wage really does not apply to all workers. It applies to formal sector workers, organized workers, and workers in large firms. And the impression that I have gotten is that minimum wages, well, actually, let me step back a little bit, that minimum wages tend to be set in these countries through a tripartite council that includes representatives of the organized business sector, usually the Chamber of Commerce, organized unions, which tend to be public sector unions, which is a bit odd since the minimum wage often doesn't apply to public sector workers, and the government. And to me, and this is a question I'd like the rest of the panel to think about, to me, in that case, minimum wages are really, the minimum wage setting mechanism is really a way in which former sector employers and organized formal sector labor groups can get together to negotiate wages in the formal sector in an environment where there are really not strong labor unions and not strong labor rights in the private sector. And so in that sense, minimum wages become a substitute for collective bargaining in the formal sector. Okay, thank you.
Excellent, thanks, Tim. I know that Piotr wants to come in on my earlier comment about the distribution of elasticities in developing countries and whether we control for enforcement levels. But I'd like to also set out a challenge to him and to Uma, who will follow, in relation to a little bit more about the right-hand side of the equation, and we're trying to figure out what it is that impacts on enforcement or violation levels. So surely it's about the size of the firm. You know, instead of just productivity differences, it's about the size of the firm, whether the firm is foreign or locally owned. We know that foreign-owned firms are far less likely to violate the laws. We also know that state resources matter. So a state that puts a huge amount of resources towards inspection will see lower levels of violation. We know that there are peer effects that exist. So if my neighbor is paying the minimum wage, I better pay the minimum wage. There's also the overlaying factor of partial levels of compliance. So if you could sort of think a little bit around that and reflect on some of the country experiences, both for Piotr and then Uma, who will follow him. Piotr?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Harun. So before I actually answer this question, I would like to have a short comment on Tim and Lucas, very short. So I think that's a very valid distinction between differentiating by occupation or sector and differentiating minimum wages by region. I think it's crucial. Just let's look at what happened in Germany, which is obviously a country with a culture of obedience and very high institutional capacity of it to enforce. And they used to have occupational and sectoral minimum wages only, and they moved to national minimum wage, because even in that like developed enforcement setting, it was not an optimal solution. Some occupational groups were left out. It was just too complex, and they found it was not really fair. And as the regional differences are not that huge, then a national minimum wage is a solution for them. Speaking about the elasticities between the trade-off between the employment elasticity and enforcement, if there is some, probably there is some, but on the one hand, we really struggle with rigorous research that could provide evidence, because even in Europe, it's very challenging to actually analyze how many of the, let's say, violated workers would be jobless if the minimum wage was enforced. But when we look at the Central and Eastern European countries, 10 of them, and we look at the group of workers who are earning below the minimum wage, we actually find that 70% of these workers, they earn not only less than the current minimum wage, but they earn less than the minimum wage a year before. And that actually suggests that it's more about some kind of persistent partial compliance with the laws, rather than a trade-off between redundancy and violating the minimum wage. So I think that the trade-off between enforcement and employment, probably there is some, but it's not. It shouldn't be a main factor in the discussion about enforcement and compliance and inspection. Regarding the right-hand side variables, it's definitely very complex, and I'm not sure if it's only about the resources available for inspections. I just checked the data, the ILO data on the labor inspection indicators in the European countries, and I look at Poland, which is a country that struggles a little bit with enforcement, and I see that the number of inspectors per 10,000 workers is actually above the European average. So when we look at what are the resources available, the people are there. But when we look at how many inspections are conducted by a single inspector per year, we actually see that that number is about 50% of the European average. So there is something happening in the organization and of the inspection and how the inspections are conducted that we actually very often struggle to quantify and struggle to measure. But I think that the process matters a lot, and the simple it gets, I think the reporting, as Tim was saying, was explaining the Costa Rican experience. I think the simplicity also in the reporting and in the procedures to for fines and the punishment really matter, because the organization can actually be of inspection can be very complex and very slow and inefficient, and then the resources might not be really the driver.
Okay. I'd just like to go in with one comment on the single minimum wage system. I think the point that Lucas made is very important with regard to large countries having a number of regions with varying living standards. I think the point there is very clear that you would have to have a regional level minimum wage, not just have a national minimum wage. But I think what's probably much more in practice and what you see in a number of countries, whether it is Costa Rica or whether even in a sense in Brazil, where you have the national minimum wage, but you also have certain federal minimum wage levels depending upon the region that have been introduced over the last 5 to 8 years. And you also have certain industrial or occupational minimum wages in these countries. So, you could sort of have a hybrid system, but like Tim said, there has to be a kind of a national minimum wage, which everybody is aware of, which every worker knows, so that you can sort of ensure that, worker knows what he is being paid for and what his rights are. And I think that, in a sense, itself helps to improve compliance. Now, linking that entire issue to the question of what needs to be done to the right-hand side variables, I think there are a number of examples that one can take into consideration with regard to improving compliance. I think Piotr and Tim raised this whole issue about working extra hours and not being paid for it. There has been this interesting system that has been introduced in United Arab Emirates, where actually they are using the new technologies to make the payment of wages. So, you're making the wage payment through an electronic system, which basically tries to ensure that you're paid for what you work. Now, this can be a sort of a system that can ensure whether workers are receiving the wages that they are supposed to be getting or not, unlike the other register system which we had under the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, where it was much more like, you have a register and you sign the register, but nobody knows whether you got the minimum wage or not. So, you can have foolproof systems today with the new technology, which can be used to ensure that workers are paid wages. The second issue that I do think is very important is taking the onus of responsibility as far as the social partners are concerned. So, if the unions are again much more active and go with the labor inspector and actually inspect many of these places and sort of ensure whether the workers are being paid or not, that could also have a huge influence as far as improving compliance is concerned. And this was actually observed in the case of Philippines. And the third issue that actually, Haroon, you very rightly raised is whether, is there an issue of finances or not? Probably in many of the developing countries, this is an issue actually, because what we have seen in many developing countries of late over the past 10 years is that the number of labor inspectorates have been declining, and in many areas, the profile of the labor inspection has actually been undergoing a change. So they are no longer inspecting whether the workers are getting minimum wages or not, but they are doing a whole lot of other activities. So this is an issue that we need to take up front and try to actually go into a discussion with many of the government officials.
Yeah, I think that's a really important discussion that Uma and her ILO colleagues will enter into with governments around the world, which is how are you thinking about enforcement mechanisms. But Lucas, if I could just ask you, I mean, I know you've done a lot of work on Argentina and other Latin American countries in terms of what are these determinants of levels of violation. I've mentioned firm size and so on, but there are all sorts of things that one needs to think about in modeling this interaction, if you like, between the firm and the inspector. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I will try to follow your comment, Harun, but let me say that you guys make so interesting comments that I'm tempted to continue talking about the other issues. But anyway, let me focus on what you have been saying, Harun. So, for the work we have been doing in Latin America, when you have on the left-hand side compliance, and you include a number of correlates on the right-hand side, what you really see is that there is a very, very high correlation between the level of education of the worker and the level of compliance, as we can expect, and also a very, very high correlation between firm size and compliance. So workers with low levels of education and working in small firms have extremely high levels of compliance, like about 90% earn below the minimum wage. Low-skilled workers work in a small firm in South America, 90% earn below the minimum wage. And if you have people with a university degree and work in a large firm, 100% earn above the minimum wage. So very high correlations on there, which sort of suggests that there is something related to productivity, but also something related to knowledge about workers' rights. And the other, Harun, sorry, can you repeat the other comment that you made?
No, so mine is just broadly, Lucas, in thinking about, I remember your work in Argentina where you showed that the number of inspectors, I don't recall whether the coefficient was significant or not, but the number of inspectors is a right-hand side variable and its impact on violation levels. My sense is that there's so much more going on. That's what I'm trying to unpack, right? That the penalty structure is so crucial, right? So the sort of classic model is, I will violate the law if the probability of being caught conditional on the penalty value is particularly low. But even that is too narrow. But I guess in thinking about violation levels, we do need to think about the penalty structure. We do need to think about the fact that if the inspector needs to travel 2 hours to get to a farm and he or she can only do 3 inspections a day, that will impact on the probability of being inspected and therefore the probability that the firm would violate. It's those sorts of things, and I was wondering if from your work on the administrative data in Latin America, that resonates with some of the evidence you've seen.
Thanks, Harun. Absolutely. So what we want to do is to try to see how enforcement affects compliance, and we can think like there are 3 main components in enforcement. To simplify, one is private enforcement, because this is a case where the worker, the one that is suffering, know who is violating the law, the employer. So if you have a good judiciary system, the worker, if the judiciary works properly, the worker knows who is committing the violation. So with a well-functioning judiciary, you will really reduce non-compliance. So that is one instrument. The other instrument is government enforcement, which there are two main components there. One is to have inspectors conducting inspections, so that increases the probability of finding an employer who does not comply. And of course, if the penalties are extremely low, that will not be binding at all. So you also want to have penalties. So the three components are private enforcement through a well-functioning judiciary, conducting inspections, and having reasonable penalties and fines in case of non-compliance. Now, measuring the three components of enforcement is extremely hard in practice. We know, for example, we know extremely little about how the judiciary works in developing countries when it comes to violation of labor law. We know really little, and from anecdotal evidence, I know there is large variation across countries. But we need to measure that in a more systematic way. We have been doing, all of us, we have been providing some knowledge about how the government inspection works. So we have been measuring number of inspectors, number of inspections, and so on. But we still know little about fines and penalties. So we have been advancing some knowledge on one of the three key components of enforcement. And there is definitely much more to do about that.
Thanks, Lucas. I think certainly, Uma alluded to it right at the outset about the role of administrative data. And I think that's where administrative data comes into play, which is how one thinks about different sort of enforcement mechanisms and responses from firms. I'm going to ask Piotr to reflect a little bit about unconventional approaches to enforcement, and then thereafter we're going to the audience, we're going to conclude the discussion by giving each of the speakers about a minute or so to bring together some of their thoughts and also add anything to this current round of discussion. So briefly over to Piotr.
Thanks, Harun. So yeah, I think that in many countries there is a lot of attention paid to like the apparatus of control, but sometimes it's more about awareness and having policies that could be self-enforcing. I think the Costa Rican experience where the campaigns were largely about raising awareness and defining what is okay to do, what it's not, were example of that. And I have to say that I find it really interesting what the British are doing when they actually started to name and shame companies which are not paying the minimum wage. And just like a week ago, 2 weeks ago, they published a list of companies which are violating the minimum wage laws, and there is like a name of the company, the number of workers who are not getting the minimum wage, the amount of money owed to these workers. It's a huge list. The numbers vary, but I think that could be really interesting way to enforce policies, because these people who violate the laws, they don't live in the some kind of, they live basically in a society. So shaming and being able to identify these people can be something interesting as an avenue to improve enforcement.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Piotr. I think that is true that there's evidence, for example, in South Africa where huge budgets were laid out for the minimum wage for domestic workers. And hence you saw violation levels actually slightly lower than in other minimum wages in South Africa where expenditure was lower. As you say, there's also sort of the threat effect or the naming and shaming route as well. But for the audience, as you can see, there's much to be discussed. We've tried to sort of have pockets of discussion around productivity and minimum wages, the relative level that you set the minimum wage at, the determinants of violation. I think, needless to say, it's a very, very new and exciting area of research. But within that context, if I could ask Uma first, to conclude and wrap up with some of your final thoughts, please?
Yeah, I think the thing that comes to my mind simply is that simply legislating a minimum wage is not enough. Actually, that alone is not going to ensure compliance. And what you need is actually a simple and less complex minimum wage setting. You need to set the minimum wage at the right level, which should take into consideration the social partners, the workers, employers, and the government representative. And I think the most important thing is the entire institutional setup to ensure that the minimum wage that is legislated and set up is actually implemented in practice. And I think that's where we need to do a lot more research to find out what are the innovative mechanisms that can work. And what Piotr said, like, let's get into the unconventional approaches. And I think there has been some attempts also being done through the social audit scheme under the NREGA and all of that. And I think we have to come up with more of such kinds to ensure that there is more compliance. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Uma. And back to you, Piotr.
Yeah, I think that the simplicity here is a crucial thing. Not necessarily in the how the minimum wages are constructed, but in taking the account the enforcement when setting up the rules. I think that many policymakers forget about it, and they write the rules that are very ambitious, and they forget about enforcement when writing the rules. That's something that we should focus more on, thinking about regulations that are kind of self-enforcing.
Excellent. And Lucas, some final wise concluding thoughts from you?
Well, I have little to add after what you guys have been saying. I totally agree with the conclusions by Uma and Piotr. And yeah, we should focus on effective regulation. Now, as Tim mentioned some minutes ago, there is a political economy to get the right effective regulation. And at least in some Latin American countries, those workers that we are concerned about, they do not have voice. They are not organized. They are not given any place. They are in the informal sector. They have no place in the policy-making process, in the council where the minimum wage is set. So we should start thinking about, in political economy terms, giving those people for which we are really concerned, giving them some voice, some to empower them to have some impact on the policy-making process.
Thank you, Lucas. And then finally, Tim.
Okay. The main point I'd like to make is that there are very large returns to improving compliance with minimum wages and other labor regulations. As we've noted, improving compliance with minimum wages in particular is going to help the lowest income workers. It's going to help disadvantaged groups, women, young, rural workers, etc., who are more likely to earn below the minimum wage. And as far as we can tell, it does that without any negative employment effects. Indeed, it tends to improve formality across the board. And that while the packages that do lead to improved compliance are likely to vary across countries, they probably include at least three components, and all of which we've talked about. One is increased inspections and increased fines. The other is a simplified minimum wage system, especially in those countries where there's a complex minimum wage system set by industry or occupation. And the final component, as again was mentioned by a number of people, is changing the social norm so that people expect minimum wages to be complied with. And there, I think the naming and shaming of businesses that do violate minimum wage laws can be a very effective tool. It's clear that businesses do not want to be seen as violating minimum wage laws and exploiting workers. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tim. I think what is clear from our brief discussion here is that as common a active labour market policy as minimum wages are, I think there's an almost underappreciation of the importance of the follow-through, if you like, the follow-through in terms of enforcement and compliance of the law, both at the level of the policymaker and thinking through, for the policymaker to think through how can they ensure compliance and reduce violation levels with the law, but then crucially also for us as a research community to continue to question and to interrogate our models and our understanding of enforcement within the context of minimum wage setting. But let me conclude that in particular thank Uma, Tim, Lucas, and Piotr, our 4 friends from around the world who will continue to hopefully work with us on this area. And we look forward to re-engaging both offline and possibly through other Google Hangouts. Just finally, of course, for those who missed some of the discussion, but who are partly following it, you can catch this on the various YouTube channels of the DPRU. Thank you very much. We're signing off.